Let me start. I'm Jim English, and I'm the director of the Penn Humanities Forum and co-director with Mitch Frost of the Digital Humanities Forum. This is an event that's co-sponsored by the English department and by our friends here in the Kislak Center, Will Knoll, Dot Porter. So thanks to the co-sponsors. Note, if you are a Penn person and you're interested in this material, there is a companion event tomorrow. Professor Cordell will be doing a kind of lunchtime workshop that's going to be focused on the network visualization tool Gephi and kind of what can and can't be done with Gephi, judging from Ryan Cordell's own work. A lot can be done with Gephi, so I think it'll be really a worthwhile lunch hour. And that's 12 to 1:30. Lunch will be provided, but we do need to know, like now, if you haven't already registered, you want to register. So go ahead and do that on our website, or tell me, or tell Sarah in back if you intend to be there tomorrow. That's down in the Meyerson seminar room on the second floor. I'm just going to mention also another upcoming event in case there's anyone here who might be interested and hasn't already heard about it. You can read on our website. It's a boot camp, a weekend boot camp on December 6th and 7th, 2 half-day kind of workshop seminars devoted to getting up to kind of beginner speed with the programming language R, which is a very powerful, basically pretty easy, user-friendly software environment for doing various kinds of work in the social sciences and digital humanities. So if you've always wanted to do a little coding and see what that's like, this would be a nice chance to do it, and with a good experienced instructor. So check that out. If you are interested, let me know. Drop me an email so I can tell you a few advanced steps to do. Okay. Like pretty much everyone else who's doing advanced work in digital literary studies, Ryan Cordell came through the PhD program at the University of Virginia. It seems like all roads pass through Charlottesville in literary, at least, branches of DH. He took his PhD there in 2010, specializing in 19th century American literature and writing a dissertation called That Great Burning Day. Is that it? What is that a quotation from? Some old sermon or something?
From William Miller.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
That Great Burning Day. So it's a study of apocalypticism in antebellum America. His association with UVA continues as he's currently in the middle of a 3-year term as the Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in the Rare Book School. Is that what it is? The Rare Book School at Virginia? But he has, in the meantime, taken up a faculty position as assistant professor at Northeastern University, where he's also one of the principal and founding members of the NULabs for, what do you call it? Network, text maps and networks. NULab at Northeastern is really an interesting operation, and it supports innovative work in digital humanities and in the computational social sciences, and maybe most valuably in the zones of collaborative contact between them. So there may be other such centers, but not many, and it's, I think, a very fine model for these kinds of truly interdisciplinary centers. Professor Cordell's articles on Harriet Beecher Stowe, on James Fenimore Cooper, on Nathaniel Hawthorne, and on other key figures in 19th century American lit have appeared in major journals of literary study and of digital humanities. He's been a principal investigator or frontline organizer on 4 or 5 major digital projects, including Our Marathon, which is a digital archive of the Boston Marathon bombings, and the project that he's going to be talking about to us today, which is called Viral Texts. It's connected with well, I'll let him describe it. Technologies of authorship, and a piece of it is forthcoming in American literary history, which proposes a very interesting idea of kind of collective or network authorship in 19th century American letters. He's a regular prof hacker columnist for the Chronicle of Higher Ed, a prolific tweeter with thousands of followers and many thousands of tweets, and somehow manages to find time to teach, raise a family, I'm told, and do quite a lot of travel to share his work with groups like us. So I'm just delighted to have him here, and please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, although I'm not sure if it's a boon or not that I have thousands of tweets. This working okay, the mic? I tend to walk, so I needed this mic, so. All right. So on February the 8th, 1862, the Ashtabula Weekly Telegraph printed a piece called Health Hints, Follies, a list of supposedly widespread but false beliefs about daily health habits. These follies, which were attributed to a Dr. Hall, critique ideas about diet and exercise. Number one, to think that the more a man eats, the fatter and stronger he will become. About education. Number two, to believe that the more hours children study at school, the faster they learn. Home organization, to act on the presumption that the smallest room in the house is large enough to sleep in. And even ethics. Number seven, to commit an act which is felt in itself to be prejudicial, hoping that somehow or other it may be done in your case with impunity. This snippet exemplifies the listicle genre, which we often associate with popular content online in the 21st century, but which was also quite common in the 19th century newspaper. While much of the advice in Health Hints remains relatively sound 150 years after the column's printing, I suspect that within the context of this issue of the Weekly Telegraph, the piece seems like a typically quirky artifact of the mid-19th century newspaper. Casual, practical, and ephemeral. Filler on the fourth page of a four-page paper. Over the next 35 years, however, Health Hints Follies would be reprinted in at least 136 newspapers across the US, becoming one of the most widely reprinted pieces that we know of during the 19th century. By the time Follies was reprinted in the Appeal of St. Paul, Minnesota, on December the 23rd, 1899, it was substantially changed. The original list was reduced from 14 numbered to 7 unnumbered items, while words and phrases from the items themselves were altered. The article's title, which you're supposed to read as the kind of leading clause of each item in the list, had become the more direct and blunt, "You make a mistake," i.e., you make a mistake in eating without any appetite or continuing to eat after it has been satisfied, merely to gratify the taste. But the essence of the piece remained the same, having wended through newspapers and magazines across the country for decades, filling a few inches of column space in the Caledonian of St. Johnsbury, Vermont, the Pacific Commercial Advertiser of Honolulu, Hawaii, the Big Blue Union of Marysville, Kansas, the Arizona Miner of Fort Whipple, Arizona, the Morning Star and Catholic Messenger of New Orleans, and the New Ulm Weekly Review of New Ulm, Minnesota, to name just a few. In fact, this ephemeral snippet appeared in approximately 20% of the 19th century newspapers now collected in the Library of Congress's Chronicling America archive. Considered in aggregate as a widely successful newspaper piece, it seems not simply a strange curiosity, but instead a telling example of popular newspaper literature. We might say that Health Hints Follies went viral 150 years before social media. These reprints of Follies were uncovered by the reprint detection algorithm developed by my colleague, David A. Smith, for the Viral Text project at Northeastern University. Our broadest aim for viral text has been to, quote, better understand what qualities, both textual and thematic, helped particular news stories, short fiction, and poetry go viral in 19th century newspapers and magazines. But how does knowing that this snippet circulated so widely change what and how we think of it? And how might a broader knowledge of which pieces went viral during the 19th century shift our accounts of reading, writing, and literature during the period? Ultimately, my frame for answering such questions must be comparison, in the mode of what N. Catherine Hales and Jessica Pressman have named comparative textual media, which is a point of intersection between literary history, comparative media studies, digital humanities, and the history of the book. Hales and Pressman propose that, quote, genre conventions can be reconceptualized, so they are approached through the ways in which they presuppose and draw on different media functionalities. In this talk, I'm going to negotiate primarily between two mediums, 19th century newspapers and the 21st century digitized corpus of those newspapers. The latter is not merely a facsimile of the former. The digitized archive constitutes a new edition of those printed texts with both new affordances, such as the ability to analyze patterns in text strings across the corpus, and new limitations, such as the leveling out of scale among objects that in their printed edition vary widely in size and format. As Matthew Jockers argues in Macroanalysis, the mass of digitized materials now available to literary scholars necessitates not a turn away from close and toward distant reading, but instead a shuttling between macro and micro views, as we, quote, strive to understand these things we find interesting in the context of everything else, including a mass of possibly uninteresting texts. For Jockers, the two scales of analysis should and need to coexist. If antebellum circulation was a technology of aggregation and enmeshed social relationships, we can now disambiguate and analyze it, albeit always partially and provisionally, through modern technologies such as text mining and visualization. The patterns and models of textuality revealed through computational means point us back toward the archive, suggesting new questions about reprinted texts, their circulation, and the wider systems of print culture. So we need to start by talking about what antebellum newspapers were and how they operated. There we go. When Louis F. Anderson took over the editorship of the Huma series in 1856, he admitted in his salutatory editorial that he was, quote, not very distinguished as a knight of the gray goose quill, and reminded his readers of the old saw which goes thus, blessed is he who expects nothing, for verily he shall not be disappointed. Anderson continued, however, to assure his new readers that our pen will not lead us into difficulty, because our principal assistant, the scissors, will be called into frequent requisition, believing as we do that a good selection is always preferable to a bad editorial. In just a few lines, Anderson sums up a set of attitudes toward the production, authorship, and circulation of newspaper content within a newspaper system founded on textual borrowing. So when we think about a 19th century newspaper, it's actually not helpful to think about through the lens of something like the modern New York Times. The 19th century newspaper has things that would seem familiar. It has news. It has editorials here. There are still those who would sell the birthright of our nation's glory for a mess of official pottage. This is perhaps appropriate today of all days, right? But it also would include a lot of other genres. For many readers, this was a kind of one-stop shop for all kinds of content. My clicker's not working that well. Okay. Right? So we have lots of these little notices, this sort of tweet-sized news. And in fact, some newspapers would have had a whole column full of nothing but these little bite-sized nuggets from around the country. Little anecdotes here. Lots and lots of things explicitly called anecdotes. And what is an anecdote? An anecdote is a sort of quasi-truthful story that's not very well sourced and that usually has a kind of moral to it, right? A very literary but sort of partially true piece. They would have had fiction, serialized novels, short stories, short pieces written for the newspaper. And just about every newspaper in the United States would have had poetry, would have reprinted poetry. And this is also before any of this content in newspapers or magazines is protected by intellectual property laws. And so the way newspapers operated is that if I was an editor in, say, St. Louis, I would subscribe to newspapers all around the country, from New York and from Boston and from Richmond. And when they came in, I would go through them and I would find anything that I thought my readers might like, and I would cut it out and I would reprint it. And sometimes I would change it. You can see that the title of this poem changes 4 or 5 times as it moves around the country. You can see that the author disappears in a few instances, and sometimes a new author's name would get appended to things. A famous author would often get appended. And in fact, in some larger papers, there would have been someone called the exchanges editor, and their entire job would have been to comb through the exchanges, find things, cut them out, and republish them. So one of the things that I've been arguing is that in the antebellum American context, circulation often substituted for authorship, and the authority of the newspaper rested not on individual writers and editors, but instead on networks of information exchange that underlay newspaper production. In this model, the newspaper's primary value stems from who and how it connects. The circulation of text among antebellum newspapers offers a model of authorship that is communal rather than individual, distributed rather than centralized. And so I propose that an idea of the network author can help us account for the way that meaning and authority in antebellum newspapers accrued less to discrete authors or editors and more to the network of newspaper exchanges itself. For many reprinted pieces, the social and technological operations of the newspaper proxied the author function, often quite literally, as the names of source newspapers stood in place of an authorial byline. So instead of by John Greenleaf Whittier, you would get from the Sun or making the rounds. When glossed, reprinted pieces were most often framed by an editorial we, rather than a single author or editor, e.g., our principal assistant, the scissors, or we believe our readers will find the following useful. In such an environment, the value of snippets derived from their movement through the exchange system. And the process of selection and republication, through the process of selection and republications, editors appropriated the collective authority of the system, positioning their publication as one node within larger political, social, denominational, or even national networks. This idea that print culture inheres in networks is not new to scholarship in American literature or book history. In What is the History of Books?, Robert Darnton described the life cycle of printed books as a communications circuit that runs from the author to the publisher, the printer, the shipper, the bookseller, and the reader. While D.F. Mackenzie famously urged bibliographers to move away from exclusive, quote, study of the non-symbolic function of signs, and toward study of the composition, formal design, and transmission of texts by writers, printers, and publishers, their distribution through different communities by wholesalers, retailers, and teachers, their collection and classification by librarians, their meaning for and creative regeneration by readers. In framing bibliography as the sociology of texts, Mackenzie locates identifying and describing networks of relationship as the center of the field's activity. And a similar concern for the social text undergirds a crucial recent turn in American literary history, as scholars have reconsidered notions of authorship and literary property within what Meredith McGill deems the antebellum culture of reprinting, seeking to, quote, recover the vibrancy and importance of the literature that thrived under conditions of decentralized mass production. Even as scholars have ventured beyond the book to think more capaciously about antebellum print culture and authorship, however, their arguments have remained largely bound up with author exemplars. As McGill notes, this paradox emerges in large part from practical constraints. Quote, texts that circulated without authors' names attached frequently remained unindexed and untraceable, as do authored texts that are published without authors' knowledge or consent. It is precisely the hypercanonical status of Hawthorne, Poe, or Dickens that allows McGill to, quote, begin to recover the patterns of reprinting in their texts. Because the authors have well-developed bibliographies, the social text can be recovered and studied. But when every 19th century newspaper brims with original and reprinted content of all kinds, it's very difficult to know where we might even begin studying that content in a different way that gets outside of the author paradigm. And actually, like this is what I was doing today. I was at the library company looking at newspapers. And what they do is they bring the big book of newspapers, right? And as you're flipping through it, you see lots of things that say they're reprinted from this newspaper or that newspaper. You see lots of things that look a lot like reprinted content but don't say, because they didn't always say when they reprinted content. And they're very interesting sort of as individual artifacts, but knowing how to get at their circulation is very difficult, right? Like their physical counterparts, most digital archives hide more than they reveal, as keyword searches require prior knowledge of the text to be discovered and can lead to evidentiary excess. As Maurice Lee points out in a recent roundtable on evidence and the archive in J19, quote, claims about evidentiary relationships between texts are hard to falsify amid intertextual promiscuity, a dynamic that becomes increasingly irresistible as search engines make connections easier to claim. Lee's point is well taken, so far as it goes, but I would offer that keyword search is only one, and perhaps not the most compelling affordance of the digitized archive. And this is what we can't do, right? You can't just go there and say, show me all your reprinted texts, right? Repetition, and in particular circulation, which is a kind of textual repetition with a difference, is a salient pattern that the digitized archive can make more readily discernible. If the primary challenge facing scholars interested in 19th century reprinting is indeed that the newspapers and magazines are unindexed, then an algorithm can help build indices useful for approaching these materials. In the Viral Text Project, our algorithm privileges neither authors, nor genres, nor particular topics, instead attempting to automatically discover the text most frequently reprinted across 19th century newspapers. The resulting index is, in essence, a new and substantial set of enumerative bibliographies of popular newspaper literature. As a corpus, this index offers a unique window into genres and modes of authorships that are infrequently addressed by literary historians. So I want to briefly explain what we're doing computationally. And these are slides that I'm borrowing from my collaborator in computer science, and I'm going to give you my best layman's explanation of what's going on. I'm getting pretty good at this, so hopefully we can make sense of it. All right, so we have a few challenges that we're facing here. The first challenge is actually a historical challenge. As these texts circulated through the 19th century newspapers, as you saw, they were frequently changed. A line was taken out here, another line was added there, the titles changed, the authors changed. So we can't simply rely on things like titles, authors, etc. in order to find these reprinted texts. The other challenge that we're facing is the one of the 20th and 21st century. Right? When these newspapers were digitized, the text in them was recognized through optical character recognition. There are millions of pages. No one has been paid to go through and correct these pages, and so this is actually a pretty decent example of one of these. A number of friends indicted, right? This is what we've got, right? So what we want to be able to see, right, is that that passage and that passage and that passage are all the same. And so the first version of the project, we were using the Library of Congress's Chronicling America database. It's open and we can get the data, which is partly why we're using it. And at first, we only looked at 1860 and before. More recently, we've actually looked at the whole 19th century, but I'm not yet confident enough about that to report on results. They're very interesting, but I don't know what I'm talking about yet. But before 1860, so you can see we were looking at about 42,000 issues of the newspapers, about 132 distinct newspapers, although even that's pretty blurry because these newspapers were changing names, et cetera, all the time. The other challenge we have here are these unknown boundaries. So the way the Library of Congress archive works is you just have a big block of text for every page of the newspaper. No one has gone in and divided it up by article. And so we don't know where the individual articles begin and end. We just have sort of undifferentiated text data. Now, we can talk about this later, but thinking about collaboration, this would not have been an interesting problem to a computer science collaborator if this data was in better shape. Right? What made this really an interesting computational challenge was that the data was so messy. And I'm saying there are these meaningful patterns in here. Can we detect them even with all of this noise? So we're working basically with 5 grams. We've worked with other, so an n-gram is a sequence of n words, right? A 2 gram is a sequence of 2 words, a 5 gram is a sequence of 5 words. So basically, what the algorithm does is it goes through the entire archive, divides the whole thing up into these 5 grams. Her Majesty dears to congratulate, Majesty dears to congratulate the, et cetera, right? And then it's just creating an index of all the matches that it's finding. And if it's finding enough matches in 2 clusters of text, then it's going to identify a likely reprint, right? So what this means is that the texts don't have to match from end to end, right? And they can be substantially different so long as there are enough bundles of similarity. And this helps us account for all of the messiness in the data. What we get back are clusters that look something like this. And if you look at the clusters, you can see that there are clearly a lot of textual differences between these, but it's been able to see that these are probably the same text. So this is a message from the president that was reprinted in lots of newspapers. This is a short little story by T.S. Arthur, who was a popular temperance writer during the 19th century. And actually, this is, I'm showing you 4 so that you can read it, but this is a much larger cluster of text. That's the basics. If we want to dig in more, we can dig in more in the Q&A, but that's basically how this thing works, okay? So, while frequency of reprinting is not a perfect proxy for popularity or cultural importance, when taken as the kind of locus of scholarly inquiry, it produces a hybrid and decentered set of bibliographies that highlight the prevalence of understudied or ignored genres of everyday reading and writing in antebellum print culture. So I want to go through some of the genres that we're uncovering. And these are the really prominent genres. And as we're doing this, I always ask people to picture their Facebook feeds, because I think it's actually an interesting comparison, right? So of course, lots of news, right? We would expect this. This is one of my favorites. This is a story that is reporting on the message that Queen Victoria sent to James Buchanan on the completion of the transatlantic cable. And I find this really interesting because it actually went viral twice. The first time, it circulated with a lot of commentary about how rude the Queen was in her message. And then at some point, they figured out that actually what had happened is that the telegraph operator had not transcribed the entire message. There had been operator error. And so then it circulated again with the full message and with apologies to the Queen, because she had not been as rude and abrupt as everyone thought she had been. Lots of politics. The period we've looked at so far is exactly during the Mexican-American War. So a lot of stories about what is happening in that war that are circulating. As I said before, we're finding lots and lots of poetry. And when I talk about this with my students, I ask them to actually think of the YouTube videos. Right? We have no recorded sound, and actually a lot of the poems that are most widely circulated are actually music, and they often even have a line telling you what tune they can be sung to, right? Sung to the tune of the Star Spangled Banner or something like that. This is a poem by the Scottish poet Charles Mackay, and we actually know that this was indeed set to music because we have found the sheet music for this as a song as well. And some reports that this was a favorite song of Abraham Lincoln, though we've not been able to substantiate that. Oh, what happened? Okay, I don't know what happened. All right, as today, if something gets really popular, then it gets parodied, right? So the Charles Mackay poem was popular enough that we've also found clusters of parodies of the Charles Mackay poem and then parodies of the parody of the Charles Mackay poem that also circulated. It became this odd, dispute between the sexes. There was a version about bachelors and then a version that women wrote in response to the version about bachelors. It's really fantastic. Lots of household recipes and tips. So if you need to starch your shirt collars, here's a nice recipe. You can make your own starch to do so. This is one of my favorites. This is an article basically trying to convince Americans that tomatoes are not poisonous and that if you prepare them correctly, they're not even disgusting to eat. The tomato, not really a part of the American diet at this moment, right? So this is this article that circulates really widely, convincing people that it's actually okay to eat tomatoes. Lots and lots of travel narratives. Right? We're finding just these reports from all around the world. In this case, from Strasbourg, an account of sitting in the square, watching the great clock, watching the people circulate in the square. Advice columns, particularly advice columns focused on parenting and the education of children. Right? This is a huge trend in these widely reprinted pieces. And I am a parent. When I think of my Facebook feed, there's an awful lot of this, right? So it's not a surprise to me that this was popular then. Lots of sentimental stories. We know about the sentimental novel, et cetera, during the period. And there are these sort of super distilled 3 or 4 paragraph sentimental scenes that get widely republished, sometimes as truth, sometimes as fiction. And here too, my students often say, well, we don't do that. And I'm like, have you ever seen the internet? Like the videos of soldiers coming home, the videos of whatever it is that's supposed to make you weep, right? Lots of domestic stuff, I already talked about that. This was a surprise to me, I was not expecting this, but these huge columns of just trivia, just random facts, and these would get widely reprinted. Again, they remind me a lot of BuzzFeed in an interesting way, right? But this one talks about the number of languages in the world, the number of religions in the world, and there are just a ton of these, just trivia columns. Right? Lots of jokes. I used to try and explain the 19th century jokes, I no longer do. They do not translate well. This one all turns on churning butter, and it doesn't translate well, but it's funny. And then lots of these vignettes or anecdotes. And these are, again, those sort of quasi-truthful pieces. I find them really fascinating. It's the kind of thing that if your uncle emailed it to you, you would go to Snopes.com, right? And you would try and figure out if it was true. So it's like this one, and it claims to be a transcription of a letter that a husband found after his wife passed away. And the letter sort of encourages him to live a good and virtuous life. But of course, it doesn't give their names or tell you where they lived or anything that would allow you to actually find these people. It has all the marks of fiction, right? Lots of hoaxes. The Great Moon hoax is a very common one, right? But we're finding lots of these sort of scientific pieces, some of which seem like pretty junk science, but which circulated. And then here was maybe the big surprise. I started with one of these, but lists. Lists are just incredibly popular in the 19th century newspapers. Again, something we tend to think of as this thing that the internet invented, and it is just absolutely not true, right? This one doesn't have numbers, although many of them do have numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is a horribly misogynistic one about how many advantages women have in society over men, none of which I think we would think are advantages. This, if you need to know how all of the apostles died, here's a nice list that you can refer to. Okay. All right. So no scholar of antebellum periodicals would be surprised at the genres that I just listed. They're common enough in these newspapers that you would have seen them. But as I was saying before, within the context of a particular newspaper, these pieces just seem like these kind of quirky one-offs. Even when it's clear that a particular piece was reprinted, these uneven citation practices obscure the full extent of any particular snippet's journey through the system. But by identifying the most widely reprinted text across a large corpus of antebellum newspapers, we can identify the text that had some kind of significant cultural purchase, particularly among the middle class readers that consumed most 19th century newspapers. Much like the sentimental literature that has been brought to our attention in the past decades by feminist scholars, many of the most widely reprinted newspaper genres aspired towards everyday practical use. Such pieces thrive because they were easily adaptable to different material and rhetorical purposes across the newspaper network. I've also been thinking a lot about who wrote these pieces, and it's very unclear, but at the same time we have a lot of evidence that this was often done as kind of piecework by women writers in particular. And I'm thinking of Ruth Hall, which is a novel by Fanny Fern, who is the most well-paid newspaper columnist in the United States in the 19th century. And in her autobiographical novel, she talks about writing piecework for the newspapers and the way that she even talks about pieces circulating and how that would increase the subscription of the newspaper, but that the columnists wouldn't actually get paid anymore when that happened, right? So while periodical writers were not often accorded the social prestige of authorship, and I'm thinking here of Poe's biting critique of magazine writing, their work nonetheless suffused print culture more thoroughly than many of their literary counterparts. What would it mean to position the ephemeral text of the antebellum newspaper as central to our understanding of print culture during the period? And to study poetry, short stories, and novels as responses to the network-authored newspaper? We might, for instance, better recognize the way that Melville situates Ishmael's story in the Loomings chapter of Moby Dick as but one snippet among many. Here, Melville echoes the reading experiences of his contemporaries, for whom a sensational travel narrative could most often be found sandwiched between political and international news. Indeed, we might read the hybrid and sometimes jarring form of Moby Dick as a dramatic expression of the periodical form, attempting to impose order to the world through aggregation and juxtaposition. And I'm offering this not as a novel or robust reading of Melville, but instead to suggest how this corpus of reprinted periodical literature might usefully reframe our picture of American literary history. So what I want to turn to now is this idea of virality that we're using to frame the project, and this will be the last kind of major part of the talk today. So this word viral is, of course, necessarily anachronistic when applied to the 19th century. Biological viruses were not themselves named until nearly the century's end. The viral media metaphor is even more recent, linking the spread of content or information to our understanding of contagion and containment. Did antebellum poems and fiction and news stories and jokes go viral in any way analogous to the tidbits that tile our Facebook walls today? So, no surprise, I want to argue that virality can provide a useful comparative frame for thinking about the exchange of text in 19th century newspapers and magazines. In many ways, virality is another name under which to discuss bibliography. In essence, both virality and bibliography describe how often a given text was reprinted and in what venues. Unlike an enumerative bibliography, however, which focuses primarily on for witnesses, or a descriptive bibliography which attempts to account for the textual differences among witnesses, accounts of a text virality would focus on its social life and rhetorical power. How far and in what forms did it spread? In which communities did it circulate? How was the text modified, remixed, responded to, commented on? To what extent did this text saturate a given network? And how does the spread of this text compare with that of others? The lens of virality privileges questions of circulation, reception, and comparison over questions of textual authority. It elevates the social over the stemma. Interpretive frame, virality often also requires a more capacious understanding of the text, including in its ambit both sorry, this thing's cutting out. A number of related, often fragmentary texts that speak to the social, literary, or historical impact of the original item. So this network effect can be usefully modeled at the macro scale. I'm going to switch forward here. Using the 40,000 plus reprints uncovered by the Viral Text Project from before the Civil War, for instance, I've modeled the connections among the newspapers in the Chronicling America archive, using reprinting as a signal of influence, or at least of connection. If we think of reprinted text as a kind of common property among periodicals, then we can trace the movement and expression of that property. Who was trading with who, how frequently, and in what order. So I want to explain this graph really quick. So I'll zoom in, which will be helpful. All right, so the nodes, the circles here, these are individual newspapers. Glasgow Weekly Times, Evening Star, Athens Post. The lines between the newspapers, the edges, these are shared reprints. And those lines are thicker or thinner based on how many texts those two newspapers printed, right, in common. So the idea here is that one or two shared texts doesn't actually tell us all that much. There's a lot of reasons why they might share one or two texts. But when two newspapers shared thousands of the same text, this is a nice indicator of a connection that we might want to look into further, right? And so actually in this graph, even these very thin lines represent at least 100 shared text within the data set, and these very thick lines actually represent tens of thousands of shared text between the two newspapers. The colors are an attempt to sort of automatically identify communities, so groups of newspapers that were frequently reprinting the same text. And then the newspapers themselves are sized based on their centrality to the network, which is to say, basically how many other nodes are connected to them, right? Okay. By considering reprinting practices at a very large scale, we can begin to model the imagined and practical networks that gave force to reprinted newspaper pieces. And I'm just going to kind of talk through this. This has already been suggestive of some very interesting things. For one, it's realigned my geographic biases in some really interesting ways. Now, part of this has to do with the corpus that we're working with, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. But we tend in the 19th century to think about Boston and New York and Philadelphia when we talk about print culture. And what's been very, very interesting to me is the way that the network graph, in some cases, we have the New York Daily Tribune, really central to this network. But some of the most, Some of the most influential newspapers are, for instance, the Nashville Union in Nashville, Tennessee, the Glasgow Weekly Times, which is in Glasgow, Missouri. And so it's been forcing me to think about basically other places in the country as kind of brokers of information during the period. And that's been really exciting. The other thing that the network graph does is it suggests questions that we want to dig into. So when we see a really strong connection between newspapers, this is often an indication to go back into the archive. So in one case, we saw this really strong connection between, here we are, the Vermont Phoenix, which is in Brattleboro, Vermont, and the Glasgow Weekly Times in Missouri. And we're very curious about this. So I asked Abby Mullen, who is one of the PhD students working on this project with me, to investigate what was going on there. And she spent a few days on it and discovered that the editors of these two papers were brothers-in-law, right? What's interesting to me about this is I would not have known, just looking at the newspapers, to look for a connection between the Vermont Phoenix and the Glasgow Weekly Times. But by modeling it in this way, it suggested something that was worthy of that sort of close analysis. Okay. So the other thing I want to point out is that it's actually striking to me how dense the network is. In some ways, the way that the Chronicling America archive was constructed is individual states propose to the Library of Congress to digitize newspapers. They propose which newspapers they're going to digitize. And so there is actually no overarching collection plan. It's all state specific. What I've been surprised by is given the almost random sampling from state to state, how connected all these newspapers are. I was expecting actually clearer sort of communities, geographic, et cetera, to emerge. And instead what we're finding is just like all of these newspapers are reprinting all of the same things. And it's been very striking to me as I dig in. All right. What time is it? I'm not going to do this. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. Yeah, all right. So this is just up here to think. I've been trying to think about virality and how virality helps us think of about the creation of these pieces. And I've been using Jim Rodolfo and Danielle DeVos's idea of rhetorical velocity. And they're using this to frame online content today. The way we compose for recomposition, right, with an eye down the line that people will be remixing. So 19th century editors are relying on this exchange system to provide engaging content. And what I want to argue is that they were actually composing their pieces with an eye toward their readers and also the readers of papers down the line. So in the first post-Civil War issue of the Pulaski Citizen, editor Luther McCord apologizes for the sorry state of the news in the paper because, quote, "We have no exchanges yet from which to make up our news items. Our readers can readily appreciate the impossibility of making an interesting paper without something to make it of." McCord assures his readers that they hope to have a full list of exchanges by next week and per consequence a more readable number of the Citizen. So what I find interesting about this is that McCord assumes that his primary job is selecting and propagating news from elsewhere. And this apology echoes a common notion among editors during the period, that newspapers that aggregated content from elsewhere were of higher and more consistent quality than newspapers written entirely by locals. So in December of 1854, the Fremont Journal claimed that to deprive an editor of his exchanges, shut off his mail for a week, and you take away from him his very sustenance, and withdraw from him all that makes his paper interesting. We must assume that newspaper editors and writers were concerned with the rhetorical velocity of what they published. A newspaper whose content was regularly reprinted in other newspapers would, presumably, soon be added to more exchanges, as editors further down the line sought the source of the pieces that they encountered in intermediary papers. This would in turn increase the newspaper's circulation and subscription fees. So when we're thinking about 19th century newspaper snippets, we might talk of composing for recomposition in a more technical way, using composition not in its modern sense as a near synonym for writing, but also as a printer's term of art. Texts were reprinted in newspapers to help new editors compose entirely daily or weekly newspapers with small staffs. And actually one thing we know is that when they would cut out snippets, they would often sort them into drawers based on length. 1-inch columns, 2-inch columns, 3, so that when you're composing the paper, you've got that gap. You go to the 4-inch column, you find the 4-inch, and then you compose it, right? So it seems reasonable to presume that as newspapers' compositors prepare their pages each day or week, they expected, or perhaps even hoped, that other compositors in their exchange networks would later recompose their texts, extending the text rhetorical velocity to reach distant audiences. So I'm going to just sort of talk through this. In some ways, despite these transhistorical resemblances, this comparison is still difficult to make, right? And one of the major challenges is that we don't have the granular view of this historical information that we have of modern information, right? We don't have like buttons. We know how many people like something on Facebook, right? 5 million people liked it, 2 million people liked it. All that we know about these reprinted texts is that they were reprinted in 105 newspapers, right? We don't know how many people actually read it, how many people actually appreciated it. However, as Robert Payne writes in Virality 2.0, even something like a like, these really specific measures, hardly tell us all that much about what people think of content, right? He points out that people like things for all kinds of reasons. They like it because they like it. They like it because they don't like it. They like it because their brother posted it and they want their brother to think they liked him, right? And so he actually calls the like button a flat signal, that it's a binary choice, right? And the platform only allows you that binary choice. And in some ways, reprinting is very similarly a flat signal. We know it was reprinted or not. Sometimes we have a little bit of editorial information to say why, but usually we don't, right? So a lot of this is inference. So a network view of textual sharing opens up some possibilities for comparison between and among individual viral texts. Consider this viral graph. So one of the things I've been thinking about is how can we use the network visualization to compare different texts and see where and how they circulated, right? So this is that poem, The Inquiry, by Scottish poet Charles Mackay, right? And this is that interesting statistics, all of those random facts, right? And we can see which parts of the network reprinted each, right? And try and make some inferences about sort of where they would go from here. And so one thing that I've done, this is the network before the Civil War. And if we look at this, we'll see that they're very similar, but actually interesting statistics gets reprinted in more of the sort of highly central nodes than does the inquiry. And so one theory we might raise is that, well, because of that, we're going to ultimately see more reprintings of this than we will of that. And if we look at our data from the full 19th century, that's exactly what we find. Ultimately, this gets reprinted about twice as many times as this does. So there's a kind of network effect that's discernible. And this is something I've only begun to experiment with and think about how we can do this kind of comparison. Okay. Nevertheless, virality's overarching theme remains contagion. The metaphor is somewhat unsatisfying because it implies a paucity of human agency, the unintended spread of disease rather than the passing on of useful, beautiful, or entertaining content. This fact, too, perhaps explains the pervasiveness of virality for describing online content, which is often dismissed as trite and ephemeral, better than that it should spread by contact than by choice. But this caveat also points to the central reason I think the virality metaphor is useful for thinking in new ways, bibliographic and literary historical, about 19th century print culture. Considering virality forces us to subject textual transmission, repetition, and circulation to systematic scrutiny, to look beyond only human choice and examine the technological, economic, and network effects that shaped what text 19th century readers encountered in their newspapers. The newspaper was truly a mass medium, both in its reception and in its creation. Editors sifted through a mass of content to choose the selections they would distribute to their readers, who included other editors, who would in turn sift and select. To achieve the rhetorical velocity required to go viral within the system, a given piece had to resonate with readers and fit the material requirements of composition and recomposition. The model of the public sphere has been used to describe the workings of print during the 19th century, and I think virality offers a complementary model that requires consideration of people and platform, message and medium, for understanding how ideas circulated during the period. So just really briefly, I want to talk about where the project's going, and then we'll be done. So this is the first thing. We've been working with the Library of Congress's data because it's available, and we're looking for more. And this has been a few conversations. We've been incorporating other open databases into the study. So we brought in, most recently, the full 19th century of the Library of Congress's. We also brought in some magazines from a different Library of Congress collection. We've been negotiating with several of the commercial providers of historical newspapers and magazines. That's been largely unsatisfying. We can talk about that if you like. It's been a frustrating 2 years of conversation. And we're also reaching out to international partners. So I'm working right now with some partnerships in the UK so that we can do a transatlantic version of the study. I'm very interested in the way that British newspaper texts are getting reprinted in the United States and vice versa. We've also been thinking about other ways to visualize the data. So I have a colleague at Northeastern, Ben Schmidt, in the history department. And Ben's sort of an incredibly frustrating guy. We had a conversation in the best way. We had a conversation in the morning where he's like, I think I want to do some visualization stuff on top of your data. And I was like, awesome, here's how you get to it. And then I got an email at 10 o'clock that night. Here are some visualizations I built on top of your data. And they're brilliant. So, this is a visualization of different, he did a topic model on top of the data and then visualized the prevalence of different topics across time. And actually, if this were the live version, if we hovered over one of these topics, we could see the words in that topic and we could click to get through to the newspapers. He also, this is a different way of looking at those topics. Again, you can see their prevalence over time, so you can see how a certain topic waxes and wanes in popularity through the data set. I don't love these word clouds, but he also created a word cloud. And then this, if I have an internet connection, well, I'll pull it up. Some interesting kind of mass map. You saw some of the maps that I've generated with GIS, but this is a huge attempt to map all of the different texts, and you can sort of drag between the different texts and see what their geographies look like sort of live, and then click through to get to the text themselves. So this is another of the things we're thinking about, is other ways that people can get into our data, use the data. And I guess I'll leave it there. We're grateful to the NEH, to Northeastern, and to my various collaborators and assistants on the project. So I'll leave it there. Yes?
When do intellectual property rights laws come into play?
They don't really come into play with newspapers until, I believe it's 1920-something. However, what does change through there's a few things that change through the 19th century that change the practice rather than the law. So one of them is the growth of wire services. Right? The wire services begin before the Civil War, but they're not that prominent. But as the wire services become more and more prominent, the newspapers are still sharing text of all kinds, but it's a different way, right? It's a kind of formalized agreement rather than the slightly less formal exchanges system that happens before that. The other thing that happens is that journalism is increasingly professionalized, and the newspapers themselves, their staffs grow. So in the early 19th century, most of these newspapers were being put together by 3 or 4 people, at most, sometimes one or two people. They don't really have reporters. They just have an editor and a compositor and maybe one more editor, right? As the newspapers grow, though, they hire reporters. The value of kind of local content grows. And then you begin to see kind of really strict segmentation. So even like in the 1870s, the newspapers begin to shift, and you've got like the local news, and then you'll have a section called either From the Exchanges or From the Wire or something like that. So they begin to group all of the reprinted content into one section of the newspaper, whereas before it's just all through the newspaper. So I think it's these things that are happening, right? So there's the kind of agreements of the wire services, there's the increasing professionalization of journalism that change what a newspaper looks like through the century. But it's actually not illegal to do this kind of reprinting until the early 20th century. But it's less prevalent, I guess, yeah.
Great stuff. I'm interested in the economics and the appeal, because ultimately, if you're putting together a newspaper, you want to have it successful, and the economics related to that, and various, again, cultural areas, different groups of people thinking about or seeing these things and appealing to that, and then saying, "Oh, buy the newspaper, spread it around," or whatever. Yeah. So I presume that there's some research you're looking at in that particular area. You know, in some ways masked by all this. Have you looked at that?
Yes. A few things going on here. I mean, the first kind of economic piece here is there's some really interesting research that basically shows the explosion of newspapers as a thing in the 19th century absolutely rely on this kind of reprinting, because print is getting a lot cheaper, right? The printing presses are becoming more accessible, and so you go from, Ben Franklin, I'm going to forget the exact number, but in his autobiography, he sort of marvels that there are just over, I think, 100 newspapers in the country. Whereas by the 1840s, there are tens of thousands of newspapers in the country. And most, I didn't mention this, but most towns would have had not one, but at least two newspapers, one for each political party, right? There would have been the Republican newspaper, the Democratic newspaper. Most religious denominations also would have run a newspaper, perhaps a few local newspapers. So they're all partisan, very partisan. And in fact, most of the editors are basically political appointees. They send people to various towns to start a newspaper to endorse their party. So that's part of the economics, right, is that the party is supporting these because it's a way of getting the party's message out. But with that explosion, again, most of these newspapers are being run by a few people. They can't write a daily newspaper, write, compose, print a daily newspaper. And so they rely on this kind of selection in order to put out a regular product. Like it's built into the economics right from the bottom. And in fact, in some ways,
I'm looking at the appeal, though,
yeah.
of a particular item, you know, the inquiry versus the...
of a particular newspaper?
And why that particular one would strike a chord and then be much more viral than other areas. And that's a hard thing to...
It is. I mean, this is precisely why I'm interested in this project, right? Is like, ultimately, it's like which ones were reprinted and why. Right. And it does differ depending on what kind of thing it is, right? Like a poem is a really different thing than a sort of political piece, right? Which I think this is mostly circulating because all the editors are, you know, trying to move that message, whereas the poem is maybe more interesting. So I'm always really hungry for those moments when the editors actually do say something about why they're reprinting it. And you do get those. You'll have a moment where they say, this piece has been making the rounds, and we think it will be particularly useful to all of the mothers in our readership. And it's always really small like that, but it's I grab onto it because it's something that tells me, like, why are you doing this? But your question is what's going to keep me busy for the next decade. I don't right. I don't want to select. Can someone, or it doesn't matter. Here. Who's going? This lady? Yes, right here.
I'm wondering, have many of these historical newspapers been digitized? For instance, if you came from Wabash, Minnesota, and you wanted to do research on that newspaper, have many of them been digitized so you could go back to 1910 or 1885?
There are a lot that have been digitized. I mean, the number that have been digitized, though, is a tiny fraction of the number that exist in archives. And the number that exists in archives are only a fraction of the number that were actually printed, right? And so, I mean, it's, what is in the digital archive is not total and never will be, right? At the same time, they are growing, and it depends on what you mean. I mean, we have been limited to what's in the Library of Congress's data. There are huge databases by Redex and EBSCO and Gale, right, that have historical newspapers and magazines in them. And if your library subscribes to them, you can browse them, you can search them. What you can't do is data mine them. Even if your library is paying for the database, you can't data mine them. And that's been a real stumbling block for us.
So I was really interested in this kind of idea of like editorial primacy and kind of what comes from taking the same piece and creating new juxtapositions and collage and so forth. And I was wondering if you had done any work looking at pieces that kind of had been printed many times over, looking at what appeared next to them and the kind of meaning that gets exposed by editorial sensibilities and political sensibilities from that collage.
Yeah, that's, I mean, some. Although in some ways what we're doing is precisely the opposite of that, right? Which is we're trying to, out of this mass, we're trying to sort of extract pieces and put them all together. So like all the versions of this text and all the versions of that text. One of the reasons, I mean, I didn't say this, but we're creating, you know, an open database of our findings, and it's not an archive because we're using all these other archives, but it's sort of, you can see the cluster of all these reprinted texts, and then you can click through to the original archive. And so why are we doing that? The reason we're doing that is, I just gave you another question. Why are we doing that? The reason we're doing that is that I have my interests within these reprinted texts. I mean, I'm a literary scholar, so I don't tend to be as interested in some of the sort of presidential speeches, et cetera, that were reprinted. But there are others who will be, and who will be interested in the kind of question that you're asking. And so I'm hoping that once that's live, that lots of people interested in periodicals will come and make lots of use of it in different ways. Thus far, I have plenty of work to do just sort of dealing with the disambiguated version, much less the ambiguated version. Yeah.
Hi. Okay. So I thought it was really interesting during your talk when you kept kind of referring to contemporary networks that we're more familiar with, like, you know, like YouTube or Facebook or things like that. You even have the like button. Yeah. So I'm wondering how much of your project is kind of informed by our understanding of kind of contemporary networks today, and also vice versa. Like, how much do we understand this contemporary network in looking at the 19th century, and where does that comparison kind of fall apart,
Yeah.
or if it does?
Yeah, I'll give you the first place where it really falls apart, which has to do with time, right? I mean, something today, when we talk about it going viral, it's something that spreads in a matter of hours or maybe days, right? And a lot of these stories, they circulated over years or even decades. And that has a lot to do with the stuff I was explaining, like the way they would cut it out and put it into a drawer, and then, you know, who knows, they might come to that piece 3 years later. So I do have a kind of working assumption that if something was reprinted enough, that there's something there, right, that we can kind of grab onto. But that's a really salient difference between what this historical phenomenon I'm talking about and the modern phenomenon. I think that I kind of lean on the comparisons. I mean, partly it's useful with students. This is obviously not a room of students. But I also, my own work is really invested in thinking about different kinds of continuities where we tend to see breaks, if that makes sense. And even when I think about something bigger like the digital humanities, like I tend to think of it not as this sort of new thing that descended on the earth, but something that grows out of work in library science and information science, and actually a lot of work in bibliography and textual studies. And so yeah, I do kind of, I get fascinated with the continuities in a way, but there are definitely these distinct differences that I try and at least be aware of when I talk about, and particularly when I write about the work. Yeah.
Thanks, Ryan. This is really interesting stuff, and I love your visualizations. When you were talking about New York and Boston and Philadelphia, and kind of running them down, no, but when you're talking there about, I think you used the word centrality when you looked at a couple of the largest circles on that visualization. And you said, you wouldn't expect to see Missouri looming so large. I'm not clear exactly what kind of centrality or scaling we're really looking at there. Is it still relevant to think in terms of origins or sources at all in this model? And do we need to make, and can we make a distinction between a site that is the originator of a lot of material that goes on to have a kind of a wide dispersion versus a site that is, through which a lot of material is passing, but from which very little originates?
Yeah. So this is a question that I think someone asks every time I talk about this work because it's a really important question. And the short answer is that actually for most of these clusters, we don't actually know where they originate, or we don't have that newspaper in our data.
You can't really pull that out of your data set.
Right. Sometimes we know, and one of the challenges is that even if the very first instance we have identified does not say that it came from somewhere else, the way that these newspapers work, that does not mean it didn't come from somewhere else. So there is a convention in 19th century newspapers where they will talk about an original piece. And what an original piece means is not that it's new to the world, but that we're the first newspaper to print it. So again, if you see that, that's a nice clue. So I try and be really careful when I talk about this to not make any claims about origins, because I feel like I just don't know most of the time. I don't know if it's not in our data. I don't know if it's, again, because there's just so many newspapers outside of our data. So when we look at something like this, what we're looking at are, I use this term brokers of information, because that's really that's the claim that I think I can make. The claim I think I can make is that these are newspapers that were really important for passing content on to other newspapers. Origins are something that I need to wrestle with more, and I don't know exactly how we're going to get at it, actually, given...
I guess maybe the further question I'd want to ask then is, are you proposing the sort of the power of the broker as an alternative kind of theory of cultural power to the power of the originator or the author in a more traditional sense? Yeah. I mean, you're getting at where I'm trying to go with this idea of the network author, right? Because we have in all of these editorials, what seems increasingly clear to me is that editors prided themselves on how well they aggregated and selected, right? And that this was actually the creative act of being an editor. It was not about writing amazing stuff. It was about finding amazing stuff and reprinting it, right? And so, yeah, I mean, partly what I'm trying to get at is that there's this other formation of textual creation and dissemination that is not what we tend to think of with authorship, or the sort of about the production. It's about cultivation, it's about selection, it's about aggregation. And that this was not more important than sort of authorship, but there was this other kind of formation that was existing alongside of. There's a lot of scholarship about the rise of authorship in the early 19th century as a concept, as a kind of value. And what I'm saying is that there's this other kind of textual production emerging at the same time. And that's at least equally influential to this idea of authorship, right? Sorry.
Hey, you were talking at one point about how one of the things that's different about the digital and the material is that you can tell scale. And I was wondering what scale also has to do with what gets reprinted and what doesn't. Are these central things like the Daily Dispatch, do they just have more column inches? Or does that matter, the size of these papers in terms of their actual physical nature?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I was saying is that the digital archive flattens scale, which is to say, like, when you come to a page, it's always presented in the same window, even if this newspaper was this size and this newspaper was this size. It is true that, I mean, there is a pretty, I mean, I can tell you what a 19th century newspaper generally looks like. It's generally this big open. It's a folio. It's one sheet printed and folded, right? I mean, so 4 pages. And that is really the convention until the 1870s. It begins, I mean, there's some newspapers that are bigger. There's some like Sunday supplements that are bigger. But most of them are these 4-page things for a long time. So yeah, are there material differences? I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, I think for the most part, the material newspaper is roughly the same. They're all printed with very similar font. And actually, they don't even have like a lot of images, right? It's all text until, again, later in the 19th century. What I do think has a lot to do with centrality has to do with geography and transportation networks and then communication networks. So one of the things we're finding, I mean, Nashville, which I told you was sort of surprising, as I thought about it, actually, it's not at all surprising because Nashville is right in the middle of the country, right? I mean, if anything's going north to south or east to west or vice versa, it's going to go through Nashville, right? So the idea that it was an important broker is not at all surprising, but it's not a place that we tend to think about when we think about 19th century print culture. The other thing I didn't show you here, but I have done some work mapping, and I've done, for instance, layering our reprinting history over a GIS data set of the 19th century rail network. And there's an exact correspondence, basically. I mean, basically, the places that are central are railroad hubs, right? And so again, this is not surprising, but it's also something that it's an aspect of print culture that I don't think we often focus on, and that for me became apparent the first time I put this thing on a map, frankly. I was like, oh, yeah, of course, right? The railroad. So I think that has more to do with it than probably the size of the papers. Yeah. I'll leave it at that.
I have the exact same question. There's
Oh.
an obvious question of whether column size had an effect on the size of those cells.
Sure.
So I have a kind of a different question, but I was just a little curious about the collaborative process. So you're working with a computer, with a computer scientist who's helped you, or who's helped kind of come up with a program to analyze the newspapers. So I was just kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about the collaborative process, kind of what you bring to the table, what he's bringing to the table, and how you kind of work together. Yeah. If you kind of work together at all, right? Because you can easily like kind of imagine a situation where you split the work up between the two of you, and then kind of that's that, right? And each of you publish on your own. So I was, yeah, if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a really fortunate circumstance. So David was a classics undergraduate, and then worked on the Perseus project. I don't know if people have heard of that, as an undergraduate, and then that convinced him to go get his PhD in computer science rather than classics. But he's particularly interested in issues of digital libraries, information architecture for humanities research. But he does natural language processing. I mean, that's his background. And so in yet another fortunate circumstance, I was working on reprinting at a much smaller scale. I was basically doing handwork on reprinting and then mapping it when I interviewed for the job at Northeastern. And Northeastern hired David and I under the same cluster hire because they thought our research would dovetail. There are not many instances in the academy where this happens, right? And actually, so we got hired, and then when we had both accepted the offers, Northeastern said, "Oh, we hired this guy David Smith, who does he does pattern detection mostly online. He was mostly doing text duplicate detection in online environments, like seeing the way that text circulated through blogs and Twitter and things like that." And so I sent him an email immediately before we even started at Northeastern, and we started collaborating like right away. What's interesting about that process is that we have a sort of continuing conversation about what will continue to be interesting and publishable for us both. And that's been both a challenge and I think a real opportunity for me to think about what people in other disciplines do and what's, I'm going to get this a long way. The reason that I think there are not a lot of computer scientists collaborating with humanists is because we have no idea what they do. And we think that they build websites, and they don't, right? And we think that they build applications, which is actually usually not what they do, right? If you want someone to program for you, it's actually not probably a computer scientist you want to go to, right? They want interesting computational problems to wrestle with. And so the way that this was framed is I was like, I have this huge database of all this text. I know there are patterns of reprinting in there, but it's incredibly messy because of the 19th century changes and because of this bad OCR. Do you think we can actually find reprints within this? And he'd been working with relatively clean online texts, right? And so this presented some computational problems that were publishable for him, right? And so we had that conversation, but now actually like what I want to do is let's go get more data and just do the same thing. And that's not publishable for him. And so the conversation we're having right now is like, what's the next iteration of this project that's going to be useful for me and for you? And one of the answers is, well, can we detect reprints across languages? Right? Which is very interesting computationally because you can't just look for matching text, you have to look for matching meaning, et cetera. And so we started some conversations with scholars in Germany about getting some German historical newspapers. And the reason for this is that in the United States during the 19th century, the second largest, most prominent language for newspapers is German. I also know German, so I could actually do that project, so excellent. But you know, that's been part of the collaboration too, is about being really open constantly about like, how is this publishable for you? How is this publishable for me? We do, I mean, there is some aspect of like he does his thing, I do mine, but we have regular meetings. We also have grad students who we're working with who, you know, sort of see both of us and yeah, what expertise do I bring? Actually, so here's an example of that. I'm giving way too long of an answer, I apologize. The first time we sort of ran the algorithm and it came back, what I immediately said is there's not enough poetry here. Right? Poems are one of the most reprinted things, and there were almost no poems in the results. And the reason was that poems are short. And the method that we're using, this kind of shingling method, where it's sort of clustering these n-grams, it was looking for too many clusters, that basically there's no poem that has enough words in it. No lyric poem. The poems we were getting were these long poems of like 5 or 6 stanzas, but we weren't getting any of the 1 or 2 stanza poems. And so this is a problem we're still wrestling with, is how can we, because if you turn, you know, these are kind of knobs, right? So if you make it fuzzier, you might get more poems. You're also going to get an awful lot of bad matches. And so one of the struggles we're doing right now, so one of the things I'm doing is I'm helping to compile a set of poems that I know are reprinted that we can use as a kind of training set in order to teach the algorithm how to find poetry better, right? So that's partly my role, is partly the literary historical role, and also it's the doing stuff with the data. So the network analysis, the mapping is mostly what I do. Yeah. Mitch? Yeah.
Question about the Mitch, hang on just a second, so we can get it onto the tape.
Thanks, Ryan. I had a question about some of the outliers on that. In some ways, to me, the most fascinating were those newspapers that were totally on the edges, that were barely connected to anyone else. Is this also a way of seeing, are those sort of data artifacts, or are they like genuinely generically different kinds of newspapers? Are you seeing kind of exciting things about small papers that are doing very different kinds of writing or republishing that are actionable, or are these just sort of weird artifacts of the Library of Congress data?
So some of both. I mean, so part of what we've done too is we've dramatically simplified the nodes here, because if you go to the Library of Congress data, the newspapers in the 19th century, they changed names every like few years, sometimes even faster than that. So the Nashville Union was the Nashville Union in American, the Daily Nashville Union in American. It had like 5 or 6 names over a few decades. And the Library of Congress, actually, from their metadata, those are all listed as separate newspapers. And that's almost worthless in a network graph, because what you find is actually that the Nashville Union is really closely connected to the Nashville Union in American. Abby Mullen, who is a history student who has been working on this project, a PhD student, one of the things she has been doing is remarkable research into the newspapers themselves and compiling data about we're calling them newspaper families, right? So which of these different names are the same paper? Or you might also get the Nashville Union, this is not true of the Nashville Union, but the Nashville Union and then the weekly Nashville Union, which is kind of the digest version that comes out on the weekend. We want those to all be the same for this purpose, right? And so, I'm not gonna pull it up, but if you, in the database, you can go to the publications and you can see the families that we've sort of grouped together. She's also done fantastic research into the editors, their tenure at the newspaper, and various kinds of affiliation. Because the newspapers were switching affiliation. Sometimes, you will have a newspaper that was a Democratic newspaper, and it would be called like the St. Cloud Democrat. It will become a Republican newspaper, but still publish as the St. Cloud Democrat. So there are these really thorny issues. And so she's done amazing work sort of creating this really robust data set of the newspapers themselves that we kind of pipe it through before we create this so that we don't get some of those data artifacts. But some of what you're getting here actually, so these are all of the magazines that we've started to incorporate into the study. And it's perhaps no surprise that the magazines are mostly sharing with each other. And the one really interesting magazine is Scientific American. And one of the things we found since we incorporated the magazines into the study is that this is true. Scientific American is much more closely aligned with the newspapers than any of the other magazines. And it's because it had all of these articles about sort of interesting scientific things that the newspapers were reprinting constantly. It's one of the biggest sort of single sources that we found for reprinting anywhere. So this is interesting that most of the magazines sort of cluster over here on their own, but Scientific American sort of lives right in between the two. But the other thing is that this is, it is simplified. Like none of these papers are actually like completely disconnected from any of the others. And in fact, as I said, it's a pretty dense network. Even the ones that live on the edges are still sharing hundreds of texts with the more central newspapers. That's actually one of the challenges of making nice-looking network graphs of this data is that it's so dense. You have to simplify the edges to make it even intelligible.
So there's no such thing as a 19th century newspaper that reprints nothing?
Well, I don't want to say that because it might just be that that's not one of the newspapers that got digitized or, not in the Library of Congress's data set. I'll say that.
Following up on what Mitch was talking about, does it make sense also that some of the newspapers are much shorter lived and so that you would have less sharing because they only existed for a period of 5 or 10 years or something like that?
Yes, absolutely. And so one of the things, I didn't talk about it, but one of the things I've been doing very recently is doing sort of time-segmented network